Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Good to see you here tonight. I've asked Sister Mary Foreman to introduce our speaker. I'm going to do a very brief introduction of Mary, which will just tell you why she's here. She's a sister of the St. Gertrude's community in Cottonwood, Idaho. She's been on the faculty here for 12 years. She's chair of the Department of Theology at this point. Her field is monastic studies. The Lit Press has published a couple of her books. One is One Heart, One Soul, Many Communities, 2009. Another one is Praying with the Desert Mothers, 2005. One could say a lot more about her, but instead we're going to let her say something about Bernie McGinn. Sister Mary.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Bernard McGinn. After his wonderful two-part lecture in my History of Christian Prayer class this morning on the variety of understandings of Christian mysticism and the role of prayer and mysticism. So you're in for a treat. Dr. McGinn is the Naomi Shenstone Donnelly Professor Emeritus of Historical Theology and of the History of Christianity in the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, where he taught from 1969 to 2003 in the areas of Christian thought, mysticism, medieval papacy, monasticism, the apocalyptic tradition, the Trinity, and numerous courses on medieval history and spirituality. If I named them all, we'd be here the rest of the night. He is the author of 16 books, the editor of 12, and he's published 214 articles and given over 150 lectures at a variety of universities in North America and around the world. He has served as president of several learned societies, including the Medieval Academy of America, the American Catholic Historical Association, and the American Society of Church History. He's also served on several editorial boards, including editor-in-chief of the Paulus Press Classics of Western Spirituality. His current long-range project is a 7-volume history of Christian mysticism in the West under the general title, The Presence of God. 4 volumes have already appeared, and we get to anticipate another one this fall. Those 4 are The Origins of Mysticism, The Growth of Mysticism, The Flowering of Mysticism, and The Harvest of Mysticism in Medieval Germany. Few of us teaching a course on Christian spirituality do so without consulting Dr. McGinn's work, which has made an enormous contribution to our understanding of Christian spirituality and mysticism. One of the kernels of wisdom that I took from class this morning is that the core of Christian mysticism is the immediate consciousness of God's presence, which is in a delicate dialectic with God's absence, and that the truth of mystical experience shows up in how one is transformed in love. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bernard McGinn as he introduces us to the 3 Benedictine mystics.
Thank you so much, Sister Mary and Father Hilary, for those more than generous words. When I hear these introductions, I sometimes look around and say, who are they talking about? But I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be back here, both for my wife, Pat, and myself. We feel that any return to St. John's is really return home. We've had associations with St. John's over now 25 years or more. And so to come back and to be with this community, with old friends, and to make new friends, for us is really something important. It's something we feel very deeply. And when Hilary asked me to come and give a lecture on Benedict and the Benedictine tradition, I had to think a little bit, because I've written some about the earlier traditions of Benedictine monasticism, and I didn't want to just review anything that I had done already. But then I thought that there are indeed some important and some neglected Benedictine mystics of the later Middle Ages and the early modern period. And while these aren't necessarily very well-known names, they may be known here in St. John's, I think they're names worth thinking about, worth reviving in a certain sense. And so I put together this little talk, which is looking at three figures from 15th and 16th century, all Benedictine abbots, whom I think are an important part of the long tradition, the kind of symphony of voices that I like to think represents the Christian mystical tradition. I love Hans Urs von Balthasar's famous statement that, you know, truth is symphonic. Truth of the theological tradition is symphonic. It's not just any single voice, Thomas Aquinas or Augustine or however important these figures are. There's a kind of symphony of voices that builds into the history of Christian theology in general, but also the history of Christian mysticism. So that's where I'm going to try to go tonight with these three figures, two relatively briefly, and one of them in a little bit more detail. Although the mystical element in Christianity, broadly understood as the search for a deeper and transformative sense of God's presence, is rooted in Scripture and the life of the early church, it was not until the 3rd and 4th centuries that we can speak of mysticism as an explicitly identifiable aspect of Christian faith. The writings of the great teacher and exegete Origen form the theoretical foundation of much later mysticism, while the birth of the monastic movement in the 4th century provided the indispensable institutional matrix for mysticism both in the East and the West for well nigh the next millennium. Of course, all the baptized are called to a deeper encounter with God found in the hidden or mystical sense of Scripture, in prayer and sacraments and theology. This is evident from the preaching and teaching of the patristic masters of mysticism. Think of Gregory of Nyssa in the East and Ambrose and Augustine in the West. Nevertheless, from the 4th down through the 12th centuries, most of the major mystical authors were monks. And from the 9th century in the West, monks who followed the rule of Benedict. In the 12th century, reforms within Benedictinism, especially the Cistercians, as well as new modes of monastic and canonical religious life, such as the Carthusian monks and the Victorine canons, became important. But many traditional Benedictines contributed to the golden age of monastic mysticism in the 12th century. Think of Hildegard of Bingen, Rupert of Deutz, Peter the Venerable, etc. The situation changed dramatically around 1200, as new styles of religious life, especially the mendicants and the Beguines, sprang up to answer the spiritual needs of a rapidly urbanizing Europe. The hunger for deeper contact with God among the laity became more evident. The role of women became more important. The composition of mystical literature in the vernacular became more prominent. We think of most of the important mystical authors of the 13th and 14th century under the names of Benedictines, not so much Benedictines and Cistercians, but Franciscans and Dominicans, male and female, as well as Beguines. There are, to be sure, notable exceptions, such as the Cistercian nuns of Helfta, and among the male monastics, the Carthusian authors, Guigo of Pont and Hugh of Balma before 1300, and the anonymous but probably Carthusian author of The Cloud of Unknowing in the 1390s. And the Carthusians maintained their importance into the 15th and 16th century, especially as copyists and encyclopedists of spiritual and mystical literature. But what about the Benedictines? Were there any specifically Benedictine contributions to late medieval and early modern mysticism? I'll try to give an answer to this question by investigating three Benedictines of the 15th and 16th centuries from diverse lands. First is the German abbot, Johannes von Cassel, John of Cassel, roughly 1360 to 1430. The Spanish abbot, Garcia de Cisneros, 1455 to 1510. And finally, the figure I want to spend the most time on, the French Louis de Blois, Ludovicus Blosius, who was born in 1506 and dies in 1566. Now, these three monks are not exactly household names, perhaps even at St. John's. And it's not my intention to claim that they're to be numbered among the giant figures, the great figures of the mystical tradition. But that said, I believe they're unjustly neglected today. Each was a prolific author, and each had considerable influence. While the mystical teaching found in their works is often quite traditional, that very fact points to the ongoing significance of what you might call the Benedictine basis for Western mysticism. That is, the Benedictine foundation that remained a solid support no matter what other additions were later made to the superstructure. Second point to note is that the history of monasticism is a history of reform, both within and without the specifically Benedictine context. Calls for reform of monastic life to root out abuses and to bring it closer to Benedict's original model, or at least to update the model in ways that would not run counter to the spirit of the rule, were a constant feature, especially in the late Middle Ages. The decline in ascetic and spiritual fervor, exceptions made to the ideal of poverty, the growth of commendatory abbots, especially during the Avignon papacy and the Great Schism in the 14th century, these were just some of the abuses that continually appear to us in the historical sources. In June of 1336, for example, the former Cistercian, now Pope Benedict XII, issued an apostolic constitution, Summi Magistri, which sought to stabilize and regularize the Benedictine life by checking some of the more extreme deviations from the rule, while accepting many of what had become common mitigations of earlier austerity. In the late 14th and early 15th century, the Benedictines took up efforts for reform, the kind of efforts that had become evident at the same time among the Franciscans and the Dominicans. In 1408, for example, the Roman Pope Gregory XII appointed Ludovico Barbo as commendatory abbot of the decayed Cluniac house of Santa Justina in Padua. And under Barbo's energetic leadership, the Santa Justina reform gradually spread throughout Italy and was adopted in Monte Cassino in 1504. North of the Alps, there were several centers of reform. The Bavarian monastery of Kassel was perhaps the earliest, as can be seen from the revival of the strict Cluniac customs, the Consuetudines, by Abbot Otto Nordweiner, who was abbot there from 1377 to 1399. In the wake of the Council of Constance in the early 15th century, a synod of monks met at Petershausen in 1417, where they republished Benedict XII's decrees, the Summi Magistri, and began reforming Bavarian abbeys on the model that had been developed at Kassel. This Kassel reform was overtaken by two more potent reforms, that of Melk, begun in 1419, and the reform associated with the Abbey of Bursfeld, recognized at the Council of Basel in 1430. Well, my purpose in this very brief history is to emphasize that reform movements, large and small, regional and international, continued from the late Middle Ages and proliferated down to the Council of Trent, where in session 25, 1563, they established a universal disciplinary rules for Benedictine houses and mandated that the independent houses were to form these regional congregations. The point about this history is that each of the figures that I want to look at, John of Kassel, Garcia de Cisneros, and Louis de Blois, were deeply involved in Benedictine reform. They were among the most prominent reformers of the era. So there seems to be a definite link between the desire to reform monastic life and the need to give sound spiritual and indeed mystical teaching to monks as well as to a wider audience. So these late Benedictine mystics are reformers and mystics in a very important way. So I'll briefly look at them here, John of Cassel and Garcia de Cisneros, and then with a little bit more detail on Louis de Blois. We know little about the life of John of Cassel. He matriculated as a baccalaureus at the University of Prague in 1388 and is noted as the prior of Cassel in 1399. And in 1418, he was involved in the reform of the monastery at Weihenstephan. 1426, dedicated his work he called the Gem of the Religious, to his friend Johannes von Indersdorf. We don't even have definite dates for his birth or his death. We can only kind of estimate. His major work was a vast commentary on the rule of St. Benedict that remains unedited, possibly because it takes up 1,424 closely written double-sided folio pages in manuscript. I advise you all to go out and search for this. Despite its length, it was widely read. There are 25 surviving manuscripts of this vast commentary on the rule. The German Jesuit Joseph Sudbrack, the foremost authority on John of Cassel, notes the vast range of sources that John utilized in this Omnium Gatherum on the Benedictine life. But John of Cassel was not a man of one book. He composed biblical commentaries, numerous treatises, sermons. Many of these don't survive. He was very, very well read, not only in monastic sources, but also had a good knowledge of Thomas Aquinas and scholastic modes of argumentation. John's main claim to fame as a mystic is a relatively brief Latin treatise called usually De Adherendo Deo, on adhering to God. Some manuscripts talk about it as the De Fine Religiosi Perfectionis, on the goal of monastic perfection. It survives in 70 manuscripts in two versions, a shorter version of 16 chapters and a longer version of 23. And there's a notable difference between the two parts. The first 16 chapters are a kind of mystical handbook based on a variety of sources, but mostly with John speaking in his own voice. The last 7 chapters are a treatise on the monastic life, but they're mostly made up of citations from the Bible and long passages, often taken directly from the Desert Fathers and Cassion. Part of the popularity for this mystical handbook is that many manuscripts put it under the name of Albert the Great, Albertus Magnus. And therefore, the short version of the text was often printed in the older editions of Albert's works and can be found in its printed form there. The De Adherendo Deo takes its place in a genre that began in the 12th century, but that became increasingly important in the late Middle Ages, what I like to call the mystical handbook. Now, mystical handbooks are not much read today. They're not a sexy genre, I suppose we would say. Nevertheless, they performed a valuable function in organizing masses of material about the contemplative life, putting them in a kind of digestible form that could be used by preachers and by spiritual guides, and therefore could be handed on to posterity. Indeed, much of the influence of late medieval mysticism on the Catholic mysticism of the 16th and 17th century came through these compendia, through these mystical handbooks. Speaking of one of the Dutch examples, Hendrik Herp, the great German historian of mysticism, says the following, which I think is worth quoting. He says, "One can call Herp a compilator, as long as one does not understand this negatively from the outset. A great part of late medieval spiritual literature, and even into the modern period, is compilation. A compilator, however, does not as a rule simply copy out, but he chooses, he shortens, he expands, he explains." The Carthusians and the Franciscans were the foremost contributors to this handbook tradition. Names like the Franciscans, David of Augsburg, Rudolf of Biebrach, and Hendrik Herp, the Dutchman I cited, demonstrate that. The other great contributors were Carthusians. Guido de Ponte of Balma, Denis the Carthusian, the only person who wrote more than St. Augustine, I think, Jacob of Paradise, Nicholas Kempf, etc. John of Cassel, to the best of my knowledge, is the only late medieval Benedictine to make a very important contribution as the number of surviving manuscripts, 70 to 75. And just briefly, what's in the De Adherendo Deo? John's 23 chapters do not seem to follow any conscious plan. In the manner of monastic lectio, they circle around a number of key themes in monastic mysticism and look at them from diverse perspectives. The work was composed for his fellow monks. As you read it, it's quite clear. The De Adherendo Deo is deeply biblical. I counted 143 direct citations from the Bible in a relatively short work. But the treatise also makes heavy use of patristic and medieval sources, quoting sometimes and summarizing elsewhere. As you might expect, the classic monastic tradition is central. Cassian, the Vitae Patrum, and is very, very much cited. It's odd Gregory the Great only seems to appear once. Eastern monasticism is represented by Athanasius' Life of Antony, John Climacus, Isaac of Nineveh. The medieval tradition, Bernard of Clairvaux, is used extensively, Bonaventure. But in comparison with contemporary English mystics like Walter Hilton, there's very little use of the Victorines. But John shows acquaintance with a number of late medieval authors, especially from the handbook tradition, and he knows some of the 14th century mystics, such as Suso and Ruysbroeck. But despite his knowledge of Suso, there's really no trace in John of Cassel of the distinctive themes of what we might call Eckartian mysticism, as found in Eckhart and Suso and modified by Ruysbroeck. So, the De Adherendo Deo is a traditional monastic text in its sources with one major exception. The single most cited authority is Thomas Aquinas, who is used 13 times and often summarized. So John's years at the University of Prague gave him very good acquaintance with Thomistic theology. Now we'll look at a few aspects of the work. We'll give some idea of its flavor and contribution. As far as I know, it's never been translated into English. John speaks about the need for reading Scripture. He doesn't spend much time in liturgical prayer or talking about that, but he presumes the monastic life, as you can see from several commentaries. He devotes chapters to such traditional monastic themes as purity of heart, importance of conscience, the role of contempt of self, the distinction between what he calls the evil of speaking and the good of silence, and the need for solitude is also stressed, as is the necessity for leaving behind all the phantasms of the world that could interfere with the search for God within. Summarizes this in chapter 10. I quote here just very briefly. Above all, God is pleased with a mind bare of all phantasms, that is, images, forms, and likenesses of created things. Now, Eckhart and the German mystics also insisted on that, but in very different kind of language from what you find in John of Cassel. The mystical themes of the De Adherendo are not difficult to summarize. John makes use of the tripartite Augustinian view of the higher powers of the soul, that is, memory, intellect, and will, but he doesn't give these an explicit Trinitarian dimension. In chapter 3, he puts it this way. The image of God expressed in the soul consists in these three powers, namely reason, memory, and will. As long as these powers are not totally impressed in God, the soul is not God-formed, deiformis, according to its original creation. Therefore, all three powers must be conformed to their true form, that is God, and shaped as wax is shaped by a seal. In practice, however, John mostly insists that this process, the path to union and deification, involves intellect and will, and he talks about their relationship. Love is of central importance for him, And one of the most impressive chapters of the work, chapter 12, is entitled De Amore Dei Quam Efficax Sit. How powerful and efficacious is the love of God. And here he praises love as follows. And again, I'm trying to give you a little bit of the flavor of this work. He says, indeed, it is love alone by which we are converted to God. We are transformed into God. We adhere to God. We are united to God so that we become one spirit with him, and we are made blessed, here in grace and there in glory, from him and through him. This language of being transformed into God, of becoming deiform, attaining union of spirit with God, is widely present in the first 16 chapters of the De Adherendo Deo. It kind of falls away in the last chapters, which are mostly just quotations about monastic practice. John of Cassel, unlike a number of late medieval authors, did not construct itineraries of the path to union or try to distinguish its various forms. His teaching remains on what we might call the level of general spiritual rhetoric. A good example is a passage like this from chapter 6. He says, and thus, transformed in a certain way into God, a person cannot think or understand or love or remember anything save God and about God. He does not see other creatures or even himself except in God, and does not love anything but God alone, and does not remember other things or himself save in God. Such strong language about deification, however, is qualified by invoking, a more traditional formula. He goes on to say, this is a unity of spirit and of love by which a person with all his desires is conformed to the heavenly and eternal will, so that he might be through grace what God is through nature. So there's strong language about become deified, but then the very traditional formula, your deification is by grace, not by nature. John also devotes an entire chapter, chapter 9, to contemplatio, another of the central themes in monastic mysticism. And here is the one place where he cites the Dionysian writings, because he sees the importance of the negative way, what he calls the via remotionis. And then he goes on to distinguish between two kinds of contemplation, which is quite interesting. The contemplation of the philosophers, contemplatio philosophorum, which relates to intellect, and the contemplatio sanctorum, which he says is, quote, for the sake of love as its object, that is, God as contemplated, and therefore it does not rest in the intellect through knowledge, but through love it moves on into desire. Those of you who know Thomas Aquinas will remember, this is directly out of Thomas Aquinas, not so much the Summa, but the sentences commentary, the distinction of philosophic and Christian contemplation. There is one place in the first part of the De Adherendo where John of Cassel strikes a note that will become controversial in later mysticism. In chapter 6, in the midst of the discussion of how the true lover of Christ should act, John counsels a form of almost quietistic non-resistance to temptation in the midst of contemplative states. This is what he says. If the will remains good and has been purely conformed with and united to God in understanding, there is no harm, non nocet, there is no harm if the flesh and sensuality in the exterior person may be moved toward evil and may be sluggish toward the good, even if the interior person is sluggish in stirring up devotion. One should only adhere to God in faith and goodwill and with a naked intellect. Now, John certainly isn't counseling what Miguel de Molinos and the Quietists were accused of, that is, of advising perfected souls in pure contemplation not to put up resistance to sinful acts in the exterior person. But had he been alive at the end of the 17th century, he probably shouldn't have said that, because it could have been slightly dangerous. Finally, the De Adherendo Deo is not explicitly Christocentric in its structure and exposition, but that doesn't mean there's not an important role for Christ. But what's interesting is that this German Benedictine's work does not share in the pervasive Christocentric tone of many contemporary late medieval texts, especially in terms of the emotional affectivity and devotion to the bleeding cross on the Christ. So there's Christological language, but it's not Christologically organized. It's much more traditional Benedictine spirituality, I think, updated for this particular context. Very briefly, Garcia Jimenez de Cisneros, abbot of Montserrat from 1499 to 1510, and nephew of the famous reforming Franciscan Cardinal Francisco de Cisneros, entered the monastery of St. Benedict of Valladolid about 1475. This house, founded in 1390, was famous for its austerity and its strict enclosure. And during the 15th century, its reforming spirit influenced a growing number of Benedictine houses in Spain. And in 1497, Pope Alexander VI recognized the observancia of the Valladolid monastery as monasteries as a congregation. In 1492, Cisneros was sent to the ancient but now decayed monastery of Our Lady of Montserrat, sent as prior, to implement reform, a task that he pursued with great energy on both the material and the spiritual levels. The monastic historian G.M. Colombas put it this way. He says, Jimenez de Cisneros was the creator of the great Montserrat of modern times. One of Cisneros' initiatives was the establishment of a printing press in 1499 and 1500 for the dissemination of theological and spiritual works. And among the first works printed were his own two writings, published in 1500. The Directorio de las Horas Canónicas, which was a liturgical manual, and the second work, which I want to just briefly talk about, the Exercitatio de la Vida Espiritual. Both works were composed in Spanish, but they were issued virtually simultaneously in Spanish and Latin. And the Exercitatorio was widely diffused in the congregation of Valladolid and in other monastic circles throughout the 16th century and into the 17th century. There are 4 more Spanish editions in the 16th century, and there are no less than 14 Latin editions in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was also translated into French and Italian in the 16th century. Had to wait until the 19th and 20th centuries to become available in English and in German. But this is a widely diffused work. The Exercitatorio, even more than John of Cassel, is a compilation of traditional materials on the spiritual and the mystical life. It has 69 chapters. They do follow a kind of plan. The first 30 chapters begin with an introduction to spiritual practices, and then they go on to a consideration of the traditional division into the purgative, the illuminative, and the unitive ways. The final section, chapters 31 through 68, deal with different aspects of contemplation. Contemplation of the life of Christ, contemplation in its various divisions, etc. Each chapter, especially in that last part on contemplation, contain long verbatim passages from spiritual and mystical classics, and some chapters are almost totally quotation. So while he shapes the whole, there's much more quotation, and he makes use of a whole range of authors. 2 of the 13th century authors that are widely found here are Bonaventure and Hugh of Balma, but he also cites a number of 15th century authors. Jean Gerson is crucial, but especially even more important are the writers associated with the Devotio Moderna. Gerald Zerbold von Zutphen, Thomas à Kempis, and Jean Mombert. He also uses important Carthusian authors like Ludolf of Saxony, the author of the famous Vita Christi, and the manualist Nicholas of Kempf. Cisneros' stress on the importance of the methodical practice of spiritual exercises, where he's especially dependent on Zerbold and on Mombert, forms an important link between the world of Northern European devout, the Devotio Moderna, and Spanish spirituality in the 16th century. And it's well known, of course, that Ignatius of Loyola used his visit to Montserrat in March of 1522 as his time of conversion to the interior life. And we know that his confessor, the Montserrat monk John Chanons, gave him a copy of Cisneros' Exercitatorio, kind of preparation for his general confession. Ignatius was certainly encouraged by that book and learned much from it, but his own spiritual exercises, which he began developing at Manresa only a few months afterwards, only published, of course, much later in his life, it's really based much more on his own experience than on his reading. And there is a literature, of course, that discusses that kind of relationship. So it's an inspiring moment for Ignatius, but Ignatius's exercises are rather different, at least in their content, from the exercises of Cisneros. Finally, I want to turn to Ludovicus Blosius. Cisneros' life briefly overlapped with that of the last Benedictine I want to examine. Louis de Blois was born into a noble family in Donstienne near Liège in 1506. He dies in 1566, which makes him a very close contemporary of Teresa of Avila, 1515 to 82. At a young age, Louis was sent to be a page at the court of the future Emperor Charles V, with whom he maintained friendship throughout his life. In 1520, he entered the Benedictine house of Lycée in Hainaut, in what was then the Spanish Netherlands. Between 1524 and 1530, he studied arts and theology at Louvain, but he was called to his monastery where he became abbot on July 12, 1530. He was 24, so a relatively young abbot. For the next 36 years, Louis de Blois was one of the most important figures in the Spanish Netherlands on both the religious and the civic level because of his contacts through his family with Charles V and Charles V's wife and numerous other very important figures. His reforming activities began in earnest in his own house in 1537 and soon spread more rapidly. In 1545, Pope Paul III approved his Statuta Monastica. Louis also had close connections with movements of Catholic reform in the early decades of the struggle against Lutheranism. He was a strong supporter of the Jesuits and facilitated their installation at the University of Louvain in 1552. In 1556, he wrote to Ignatius, encouraging him to send more of his followers to the north. And this was a time when Jesuits were very controversial. The Louvain theologians did not want Jesuits. Louis was one of the people who pushed them to allow the Jesuits to become established. Louis was also connected with the Cologne Charter House at St. Barbara, the major center for the translation and publication of vernacular mystical works in Latin as a way of countering Reformation attacks on Catholicism. I mean, these Carthusians of St. Barbara did more for the dissemination of late medieval mysticism into the early modern world than any other group. The most important of these translators, the Carthusian Laurentius Surius in Latin, even dedicated his edition of the Opera Omnia of Henry Suso to Blosius in 1555. The second edition of the works of Tauler, published by Surius, also cited Blosius's defense of John Tauler against the theologian Johannes von Eck, who had accused Tauler of being a forerunner of Luther. So Louis de Blois had a good knowledge of late medieval mysticism of Germany and the Low Countries, including Tauler, Suso, Rusbrook, Gregory the Great, and also some Eckhart, because Eckhart's sermons were contained in the Tauler editions. These are all, of course, vernacular works that were translated by these Carthusians into Latin to give them an international access. But this did not make Louis any less of a Benedictine. And his devotion to Augustine and Gregory the Great, for example, is evident throughout his works. Much of Louis de Blois' extensive corpus, 31 works, is taken up with monastic reform and ascetical piety. But a number of his treatises, at least 3 or 4, are mystical. And in this context, I'm going to concentrate just on the most important of these. This is the work called the Institutio Spiritualis, Spiritual Institution, Spiritual Instruction, first published in 1553. This work was immensely successful, counting 47 later editions and translations. But that's independent of its appearance in the Opera Omnia, and the Opera Omnia, there are 42 editions before 1800. So basically, there are 89 different editions of the Institutio Spiritualis between its first publication and 1800. That's doing all right. And there were translations. Translations into French, Italian, Spanish, German, and Dutch. Maximilian Sandeus, the German Jesuit who produced the first alphabetical dictionary of mysticism. It's a great work, unread today, called the Theologia Mystica Clavis, published in 1648, called Louis de Blois Optimus Mysticorum Magister. Optimus Mysticorum Magister, the best master or teacher of the mystics. What about in English? Cardinal Wiseman, the first Archbishop of Westminster after the restoration of Catholicism in 1850, appears to have been a great fan of Louis de Blois. In 1859, Wiseman wrote an elegant Latin preface to a Latin edition of Blasius's works published in London for the new English seminarians. And with the Latin now becoming available and read by these English seminarians in the latter 19th century, a number of translations of Blasius into English appeared in the following decades. I haven't done a full bibliographical search of this, but I've uncovered, I would say, at least half a dozen or more of translations of this work and also of several others. But today, he's somewhat forgotten. So I'll try to say just a little bit about why he should not be. Blasius's spiritual instruction, it's not a long work, it's longer than John of Cassel, is different from the other treatises. First of all, it is better organized and more progressive even than Cisneros. But secondly, despite the author's very wide reading, it's not basically an anthology or a handbook and does not feature extended quotations from mystical sources. Louis de Blois had absorbed a good deal of mystical teaching, but he appropriated and transformed it in his own way. In other words, Louis de Blois is an independent mystical teacher, despite his grounding both in traditional Benedictine mysticism as well as in the late medieval mysticism of Suso, Tauler, and especially Jan van Ruysbroek. And all those people would have been available to him, of course, in Latin translations in the mid-16th century. One reason why Blasius's treatise proved to be a bestseller is the tone of moderation and mildness that characterizes the text. And of course, this was unusual in the troubled times of the 16th century. Blasius's positive and balanced view of mysticism, as I read it, reminds me of a better-known French figure, born the year after he died, Francis de Sales. So let me just take a brief look at the structure of the 12 chapters of the spiritual instruction and turn to a few central aspects of his teaching, especially about the term mystical union, unio mystica. It's a term we take for granted, but actually was a relatively rare term in the mystical tradition before the 16th century. In the spiritual institution, he uses it 9 times, and his other mystical writings also use it fairly frequently. Louis' training at Louvain equipped him to thinking in a doctrinally precise way, the way that became prevalent in 16th century Catholicism. And the pastoral and pedagogical purpose of such a contemporary manual of mystical teaching meant that it could no longer afford to be a kind of exercise in, ruminative lectio divina, but had to have a teleological structure that would make it an apt pedagogical tool. And it's obvious from the preface that Louis had organized his material, as he puts it, to help the beginner, what he calls the tiro, to take on the role of what he calls the asceta, or the practitioner, on the road to becoming the sponsa verbi, the bride of the word, that is to reach mystical union, which is described in the 12th and last chapter of the treatise. The preface sets out a brief anthropological teaching about the soul and its powers, and Louis says that the sacred writers divide the soul into three different aspects: the anima, the inferior and sensitive powers of the spiritus, the three superior powers, that is memory, understanding, and will, but finally, the mens, vel apex spiritus, the mind or height of the spirit, which he describes as the naked and God-formed depth of the soul, the simple essence of the soul, marked with the image of God. He continues, according to this depth, this fundus in Latin, we speak of the superessential life, vita superessentialis, through which both the spiritual life and the active life are perfected. Now, if you're familiar with Rusbrook, this is pure Rusbrook language. In stressing the Trinitarian dimension of the soul, I think, and especially in using this term superessentialis, we see a very important kind of dissemination of Rusbrook's mysticism. And I think this is also found in this key term that I just cited, the naked depth of the soul, the nudus fundus animae in Latin, which is really Eckhart's Grund as it penetrates its way through mysticism of the late medieval and early modern period. The beginning of chapter 7, for example, he speaks of the fixed and steadfast prayer that brings the asceta, the second person, to this state. He says, he arrives at a state where God is in him and he has been rooted and made firm in God through intimate union, where I say he is free of all multiplicity and reaches as far as the simple, naked depth of the soul in which the original fountain of divinity is found. Blasius's teaching on this depth or abyss of the soul, deeper and closer to God than even the three highest powers, reaches its climax in an impassioned hymn of praise that comes at the end, the last chapter, chapter 12. He says, O noble depth and divine temple from which God never departs, O most splendid depth, fundus, in which dwells the Holy Trinity and which eternity itself is tasted. In accents very close to Tauler, Louis says that here the abyss of God invites the soul's depth or abyss back into itself. I quote, God, the uncreated abyss, calls our spirit, the created abyss, back into himself, that it may be worthy to be made one with him, so that our spirit, immersed in the deepest sea of divinity, may joyfully lose itself in God's spirit. And there's a good deal of language like that throughout the treatise. For example, in other chapters, I have sections here, quotations from chapter 8, where Louis talks about our pre-existence in God as idea. We might translate that best as archetype. Hence, he says, according to our ideal idea, our ideal archetype, we have been in God from eternity. In him, I say, we have been and are uncreated. It's the kind of language that Eckhart got in trouble for. We are uncreated in our idea in God. The exemplars of all things are in God's essence, and that same divine essence is the exemplar of all things and the single idea, the single reality. All the multiplicity of things is reduced to unity in the total, simple, and superessential essence of God. All things are one in God. Now, that treatise is structured according to a path that I said leads forward to mystical union. I'll conclude just by talking a little bit more about how he talks about union in the 12th chapter of the work. The meat of Louis de Blois' teaching is found in chapter 12. Same teaching is later reprised in chapter 11 of another mystical treatise, what he calls the Speculum Spirituale, the spiritual mirror, published in 1558. Louis says that unio mystica, that rather new term, mystical union, is the same thing as sapientia mysticae theologiae, wisdom of mystical theology. So he's using old language and new language. And he describes it as, in many of the terms that remind us of the German mystics, Tauler, Suso, Eckhart, and also Rusbrook. For Blasius, the final stage goes beyond the soul's three highest powers, and it goes beyond all thought. He says, with its higher powers lifted up, illumined, and adorned by divine grace, the soul attains the unity and nakedness of the spirit and acquires pure and untainted love and simple knowledge, that is, without any thoughts. This is contemplating the divine abyss with a peaceful, simple, and delightful active intuition without imagination or any admixture of intellect. This passing beyond is described not only as a transformation into God, but sometimes as a quasi-annihilation. In 3 places in the spiritual instruction, he also describes this as a unity without any intermediary. But it's significant that he never uses the very suspect language of unity without difference or distinction, which is what Rusbrook used at times and was attacked by Gerson and others. So, Louis de Blas' understanding of mystical union shows affinities with the sometimes suspect views of union found in Eckhart and his followers, as well as in Jan van Rusbrook. But it's very clear that he's conscious of this, and he makes the necessary distinctions in order to differentiate between his teaching and teaching that he knows was under suspicion. So in a sense, Blasius's teaching on Unio Mystica is a mixture of the old and the new. That is, the long tradition of Benedictine Western mysticism and the vibrant, though often controversial themes of the mysticism of Northern Europe in the 14th century, represented by German mystics and of course by Jan van Rusbrook among the Dutch. To conclude, well, you may well be inclined to ask, is there any reason for reading Louis de Blois, let alone the other 2 figures today? To someone like myself trying to write perhaps overly long history of Western mysticism, it is of course necessary that I look at these almost forgotten figures. But I do so in the hope that they might be given new life. Louis' world is different from ours, and I don't want to claim that his mystical teaching can compare with his contemporaries, such as Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross. Nevertheless, Blasius was able to rework many of the themes of late medieval mysticism into a form that had great influence for almost 4 centuries. I mean, just look at the additions and the use of him by other mystical authors. That's no mean achievement, I must say. And my task is not to propagandize for this Benedictine abbot, but rather to point to him and to ask readers who are hungry for spiritual wisdom to go take a look. The judgment will have to be in the eye of the beholder. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks.
You take a question or 2?
Yeah, I'll take a question or 2, sure.
Thanks. Thanks very much. I'm going to ask a question, and we don't have mics, I don't think, but if you would like to ask a question, please just stand up and ask it. But I want to ask, first of all, is there something distinctively Benedictine about Cisneros and Blasius? With Kassel, you're talking about a 1,000-page commentary on the rule. Yeah. That's clearly monastic. But is there something monastic about the other 2, the Spaniard and the Frenchman?
Well, that's one of the reasons I emphasize monastic reform. And also, each of them had a very powerful knowledge, profound knowledge of the tradition, the monastic tradition. It's a little more obvious in Kassel, perhaps, because of oversight, compassion, and the dead of body. But each of these figures, in terms of their lives, were monastic reformers who saw late medieval, early modern Benedictine monasticism as needing reform, and his day-to-day activities were really very much as Benedictine reformers. And I think they're, for me at least, I mean, they don't tell us, but for me at least, their spiritual and mystical writings were part of that reform program. because they thought that we're going to bring monks back to the true monastic life. It's not just insisting on obedience to rule and getting rid of all these expressences that have crept up, but we need to get back to deep interior spiritual life. So that's where I think the Benedictine core is that their spiritual, mystical writings are part of their reform, the Benedictine reform agenda. That's helpful. Yes, got a comment.
Bernie, it strikes me that these guys are really interesting today, and also John Tridemius, whom you did mention.
Yeah, I did know that.
He's a little flaky and weird, but he kind of fits the same package. And that they were very open to contemporary spirituality and integrating these other currents, which were not classically monastic.
That's what John Picasso. Well, he does use some of the manualist tradition, that's true. Cisneros is very open to devotion to modernity.
Right.
And Louis de Blas is very open to Northern European mysticism.
And Tridemius does the devotion modernist stuff too in his handbooks. And it seems to me that the later history of Benedictine thinkers loses the plot a little bit for various reasons. You have the Morris doing the scholarly thing with the distinctive mission.
Yeah.
Then you have revolution and the refounding of Benedictines deliberately are pushing against what was happening in contemporary spirituality and theology. And so as I look at the 21st century, or maybe let's get to the 20th, which is in the 21st, maybe Merton was starting that, but he didn't get very far because his life was quite short. And I think it does raise interesting questions about how Benedictines are faithful to their tradition and yet judiciously look at what's happening in contemporary spirituality and theology and pull that in. And maybe where we're seeing that happening today is not so much in the mainline Benedictine tradition, but in the so-called new monasticism.
Yeah.
Of people who are inspired by the rule of Benedict and affiliating with us in it in new ways, but by virtue of the condition of their life being more open to these things. So that's just a kind of observation and question. And I'd be interested to hear if you have reflection on what happens after these scholars with other Benedictine writers.
So thank you for that. I'm kind of fascinated with the new monasticism, but I don't know a lot about it. I've just been reading about it slightly. But I do think, to go back to Merton, I've read Merton for many, many years.
Could I suggest?
Oh, okay.
You'll be recorded if you speak to the mic.
Oh, okay. Oh, and do I need to be recorded, though, for... Yeah, to start with Merton, I've read Merton for 50 years or more, and I had to do a little bit of writing on contemporary 20th century mystics and what they have to offer, and I chose Merton and Teilhard de Chardin and Simon Weil. And I looked at Merton as the man who revived the tradition of contemplation. Because as you read him, you can see the immense amount of reading he'd done in all the sources when people weren't doing that in the 40s and 50s, and how he was able to convey that to a very broad audience. So I think the part of this, what we see in things like Cistercian publications here in the Classics of Western Spirituality and numerous other things, the making available the spiritual wisdom of the tradition in a way it's never been made available before. Merton is a kind of pioneer in that enterprise, and of course Cistercian publications grew out of Merton's initiative and couldn't be continued by him, but was continued by Basil Pennington and other people who were students of Merton. So I think he does have a very important role to play in the revival of the contemplative tradition. It is interesting that there aren't a lot. I mean, I think all of these figures were open to certain things. Castle did read a lot of the kind of mystical handbooks, certainly, of his time. But it's very obvious in Cisneros with the Devotio Moderna, and in Louis de Blas attempting to put together the monastic tradition with the German mysticism, which of course was controversial. And how much of that happened afterwards is I don't think it's of the same caliber as far as I know it. Now, I haven't gotten there in my history yet, so I may discover figures, and I may hear about figures that some of you know and I don't know. But I do think maybe that period in the 15th and 16th century was kind of the tail end. Too bad. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, please.
Yes, I did. Going back to this relationship of reform and this all mystics are reformers?
Are all mystic reformers? No. Are most mystics reformers? Yes. When we think of Teresa, John of the Cross, when we think of Bernard of Clairvaux, and numerous reform of religious life and mysticism often goes together. I wouldn't make it in any sense a necessity. And you know, I was struck as I was composing this paper, and I knew these figures, but I tried to learn more about them and about their lives, how deeply they were embedded in the reform movements. And, you know, they don't write these treatises to say, oh, I'm writing this so, you know, my monks will be reformed. But they were reformers, and they were very much involved in writing these mystical treatises. And I cannot help but think that they felt that to write treatises like this were a part of the reform movement, because there were many other genres that they could have written. And indeed, John of Cassel writes the vast commentary, all well and good, but then he also decides he wants to write this kind of mystical handbook, which other Benedictine abbots, as far as I can see at that time, were not, you know, were not doing. He's taking something that was traditional to Franciscans and Carthusians, saying, no, I want to write this kind of literature. So that's as much as I mean, there are a lot of things we'd like to know about their motivation that we can only make a surmise about. Yes, one more.
Quick question. Does the word mysticism, as it was used in the late medieval, early modern period?
It's not used in the late medieval period.
It's not used?
No.
It's a
modern word.
It's a modern word.
No.
Okay, my question is, does it equate exactly to the 20th century word spiritual?
Big question. That could be, let me try to give a quick answer. Mysticism is a modern word, but the term mystical is crucial since the 2nd century, and it goes along with terms like contemplative and spiritual. If we ask who are the mystics, if you went to a medieval person and said, are you a mystic, they wouldn't know what it meant. If you asked, or do you know viri spirituales, spiritual people, or do you know viri contemplativi, they would know what we're talking about. So there is a transposition back from our modern term back to that medieval period. And spirituality, in a broad sense, and mysticism are closely related, although I do think that, for me at least, spirituality is a broader term than mysticism. And spirituality is also an older term, first used in the 4th century in a letter that used to be ascribed to St. Jerome, but now we know it was written by Pelagius. Age in spiritualitate, Pelagius writes in one of his letters. So we have a great tradition from the Pelagian side of Christianity about practicing our spirituality. So that's a very short answer to a complicated. They're very closely related terms in the history. Spirituality is an old term, mysticism is a new term, but it's still a new term that reflects the tradition of the mystical dimension, the mystical sense, mystical contemplation, mystical theology.
Thank you very, very much for coming, and thank you for very good questions. And don't leave without looking at that invaluable collection of books off to the side. Thanks for coming.